I drove into the town of Abandoned Springs early in the morning, feeling a mix of curiosity and apprehension. I had been assigned to work at Blue Hill Ranch, owned by the Henderson family, even though they had originally planned to hire a more experienced cowboy. That man had died under mysterious circumstances. Rumor had it he was found next to a mangled fence, though the official explanation was simply an accident. The manager, Bart Fitzpatrick, met me in the center of town and immediately said we'd be touring the remote grazing lands. I understood that the area around the ranch was vast and most of the land was rarely used. We left town in Bart's old pickup, where the asphalt soon gave way to a dusty track. Along the way, he grimly mentioned an abandoned property called Winterlow House. The Hendersons had bought it 15 years ago, but never really developed it. Rumors swirled that dark deeds had been carried out there, and some of the workers avoided even whispering its name. They spoke of a creature resembling a wolf, but tall, bipedal, and possessing a chilling intelligence. The locals had dubbed it the Dogman and made sure to steer clear of the cursed land. Our mission was to check out a strange truck spotted near the old estate. Bart stressed that outsiders had no business there since the territory officially belonged to the Hendersons. There was a suspicion that the truck might belong to thrill seekers, or even people involved in something illegal. I could feel the tension between us. Bart seemed serious and sullen, and to be honest, I had no idea what exactly lay ahead. As we drove deeper into the remote expanses of the ranch, the landscape grew increasingly desolate. Sun-scorched grasses stretched to the horizon, and dilapidated fences and leaning posts recalled long-forgotten attempts to tame the land. It was as if nature itself had fallen into an eternal slumber. In the distance, low hills appeared, and Bart explained that behind them lay the Winterlow estate. I hadn't given much thought to the old legends, but the idea unnerved me. If my predecessor had truly perished here not by mere chance, then what exactly was lurking in these deserted places? We pressed on, and that ominous feeling within me only grew stronger. By noon, we had reached the far end of the property where the road had become nearly impassable. Sun-baked fields, interrupted by rocky cliffs, lay all around. I stared at the vast expanse and recalled scattered rumors about the Winterlow family. Locals said that many years ago, an eccentric landowner had lived there with his wife and several children, and dozens of hired hands had worked on the estate. One might think a thriving homestead would have been a regional pride, but reality had turned out quite differently. According to legend, the Winterlows were drawn to occultism. Rumor had it that the head of the family had tried to contact some ancient force said to inhabit these lands. The old-timers spoke of strange rituals and even stranger sacrifices. Sheep went missing, and later, cows and horses whose bodies bore deep torn wounds. No one dared call it outright fabrication. Perhaps that was how the story of the Dogman was born. Over time, people began disappearing in the area as well, though the cases eventually died down without any official conclusions. As Bart drove, he occasionally made brief remarks. He told me about a nighttime howl he had once heard while repairing fences nearby, a sound that sent shivers down his spine, as if both a wolf and a man were howling together. Seasoned cowboys had often seen dark silhouettes flickering at the edge of moonlight. Some even claimed to have seen eyes glowing with a yellow fire at human height. Of course, many dismissed it as fatigue or mere fear of the night prairie, yet the legend of the humanoid beast had taken hold. I remembered the tales from local bars where old-timers mentioned that even long before the Hendersons bought the land, it was considered unsettled. Some attributed it to a curse from ancient tribes. Others linked it to experiments by the Winterlow family in an attempt to harness the power of a wolf-like monster. In any case, people avoided this territory at night, and wild rumors about the abandoned house abounded. By the time we saw the faint outline of the half-ruined estate in the distance, it felt as if nature itself were holding its breath. Everything around was immersed in an oppressive silence, disturbed only by occasional gusts of wind stirring the dry bushes. A chill ran through me. If even a fraction of these stories were true, a grueling ordeal awaited us. Yet there was no choice. We had to find out who dared venture so far into these lands. Winterlow House appeared suddenly before us, as if emerging from a foggy dream. Although the sun was high, the grim silence made everything even more ominous. I noticed an old truck parked to the side. Its doors were ajar, and the cabin was packed with crates. Judging by the inscriptions on the plywood sides, this was equipment for paranormal investigators. I'd seen similar setups on TV: night vision cameras, motion sensors, recorders meant to capture voices. It seemed these people had come specifically because of the Dogman legend. We got out of the pickup and looked around. The air was stagnant, as if no one had breathed here for years. A nearby barn resembled a sagging box with a collapsed roof and dry, splintered boards. A strange odor, a mix of decay and animal stench, filled the air, making you want to keep your distance. There were no screams or voices, only the silence that made the house itself seem to repel all life. Near the porch, I saw broken steps, scattered splinters, and shards of glass. It looked like curious visitors had been here before, though none had ever seen things through to the end. Inside the truck, there were no signs of a struggle or violence, though the camera was still running. Perhaps the mysterious hunters had already gone inside in hopes of capturing something on film. Bart only gave a grim glance around. I could feel his unease. Had I not heard all those stories, I might have dismissed the house as merely abandoned and eerie. But the scratches on the leaning door, the claw marks embedded in the ground, and the overall sense of danger all warned us that we were intruding somewhere we weren't meant to be. I thought of the fate of my predecessor. Perhaps he too had decided to quickly check out something here and never returned. Cautiously, we made our way toward the entrance, peering into the empty windows. Somewhere deep inside, it felt as if a heavy gaze was lurking. I tried to convince myself that it was only my imagination. Yet something about this place evoked a primal terror. We didn't know what lay hidden behind those walls, but already the atmosphere of the house weighed on our minds, making us nervous with every step. The porch creaked ominously underfoot. I tread carefully over the rotten boards. Inside, the house was shrouded in dim light, sunlight barely piercing through grimy glass and tattered curtains. I noticed long, almost vertical scratches on the walls stretching from floor to ceiling. No dog or cougar could have left such neat, deep marks. It seemed as though inhuman claws had done the damage. We entered the central corridor where broken pieces of plaster crunched under our feet and the air reeked of dampness mixed with the odor of animal fur. Suddenly, a prickling sensation at the back of my head made me feel as if we were being watched. Bart stopped and scanned the area, as if searching for the source of the sound. Nothing disturbed the deathly silence, which only made the atmosphere more terrifying. I wondered about the investigators. Where could they have gone? Perhaps they had ventured deeper in search of evidence. In one room, once a living room, we found scattered notebooks and equipment, a toppled tripod, and a couple of camera batteries. Signs of a struggle or a panicked escape were evident. On the wall, Amid torn wallpaper, there were horrifying claw marks, and in several places, clumps of brown fur could be seen. I instinctively looked around, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But all that surrounded us was a dense, oppressive emptiness. We continued on and soon heard a faint thumping coming from below. It sounded like muffled beats against a pipe or floor, barely noticeable yet rhythmic. It appeared that strange sounds were emanating from the basement. My heart skipped a beat. Bart shot me a look that silently said, "Don't go down there." Yet I knew we had to check. If someone down there was injured or trapped, leaving them would be inhumane. A little further along the corridor, we found an open door leading down a steep staircase. The darkness below felt almost tangible, and the musty odor only intensified. A thought flashed in my mind. Perhaps here dwelled the very thing we all feared. The house was steeped in terror and a foreboding, sinister silence, as if the estate itself was warning us that things would only get worse. We decided to inspect the upper rooms before venturing into the basement. We climbed the dilapidated staircase, carefully avoiding the rotten steps. Up top, long corridors with broken doors and collapsed floors unfolded before us. It seemed that a prosperous family had once lived here. There were still traces of ornate molding on the ceiling and remnants of luxurious wallpaper in places. But now, everything looked like pitiful ruins, scarred by the claws of some unknown monster. In one of the rooms, I came across an old portrait hanging askew on the wall. It depicted the Winterlow family, a father in a sharp suit, a woman in an elegant dress, and two teenagers, a boy and a girl, whose eyes were tense and slightly frightened as they stared forward. Behind them, I noticed a vague silhouette resembling a wolf-like creature. Perhaps it was an optical illusion or a trick of the light, but the sight of the portrait sent shivers down my spine. To the left of the portrait, on a battered dresser, sat an antique leather-bound book adorned with symbols I couldn't decipher. I flipped through it carefully. Inside were writings in English and Latin. Some pages contained illustrations of rituals, offerings, and a strange creature resembling a man with a wolf's head. It reminded me of the rumors that there was a woman in the Winterlow family obsessed with harnessing a powerful force, whispers that she had sacrificed livestock, and sometimes even something more. Next, we noticed a door leading into a small storage room. Inside, overturned shelves, broken flasks, and old utensils lay scattered. But the most striking feature was a dark staircase descending further down, like a secret passage into the depths of the walls. I moved closer and caught a sharp whiff of decay emanating from it. It seemed the house had extensive internal passages, and it was quite possible that the investigators from the truck had taken this route in search of sensational evidence. Judging by the abandoned equipment, they had already encountered something dreadful. We chose not to delve any further down that route, deciding first to inspect the basement in the main corridor. But by now, I realized that the Winterlow family hadn't merely encountered the legend of the Dogman. Judging by the eerie records, these people had attempted to contact the monster, likely hoping to harness its power. However, the creature they awakened turned out to be uncontrollable, and the house remains steeped in their terror to this day. We returned to the staircase leading to the basement and carefully descended. The air grew even more stagnant, lit only by our flashlights. Old boxes, broken chairs, and scraps of burlap were piled everywhere. In the distance, I heard a muffled moan, like a desperate whisper. I signaled Bart, and we moved toward the sound, each step echoing in our hearts with unbearable dread. Behind a pile of empty boxes, we discovered a man lying on his side, his clothes soaked in blood. He was muttering about a monster with yellow eyes and enormous claws. By his appearance, he was one of those paranormal hunters. Though his pulse was still detectable, he breathed raggedly, as if he had seen something that shattered the remnants of his mind. I leaned in, trying to figure out if something irreversible had happened to him, and noticed deep, torn wounds on his shoulder. Suddenly, from somewhere on the left, there came an animalistic hiss that turned into a low growl. We froze. In the beam of my flashlight, I made out a vague silhouette. Something large and bipedal slipped between the shelves. It moved with a terrifying silence, and clearly showed no fear of humans. I shrank back in horror as all the tales of the dogman I'd ever heard flashed through my mind. It seemed this monster was no mere legend. Bart signaled for us to retreat, but first we had to rescue the injured man. I lifted him by the shoulders while Bart tried to cover our escape. Then came a loud sound like claws striking wood. Malicious breathing rasped nearby as if the creature was rummaging through dark corners in search of prey. In the trembling beam of my flashlight, I caught a yellowish glimmer of eyes, and a chill froze me. The creature was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We moved toward the staircase, pushing aside boxes. I felt the floor sagging underfoot, as if it might give way at any moment. A shadow flitted behind us, slipping into the darkness. We reached the steps and began to climb, dragging the semi-conscious hunter with us. Behind, a loud rustling and clanging of metal echoed. Something had forcefully tossed a rusty can aside. I could feel the intense gaze of a beast watching us from the dark. When we reached the corridor, the house was bathed in the twilight of sunset. Light barely seeping through broken windows. We hurried toward the exit, knowing that staying here meant certain doom. The injured man, leaning heavily on me, mumbled about a second investigator who, according to him, had remained somewhere deep in the basement. But we had already heard the ominous roar of the dogmen, and it became clear. Down there, only the lifeless remains of the unfortunate were left. We crossed the living room, carefully stepping over debris. Suddenly, a huge shadow burst out from a doorway. I instinctively recoiled, and in the dim light saw the outlines of a monster. A wolf-like head with bared fangs, powerful paws armed with knife-like claws. Its eyes glowed with a cold yellow fire, and a low growl reverberated through the corridor. Bart raised his gun and fired at the creature in a desperate bid to scare it off. A loud report rang out. The bullet struck the wall, yet the shadow vanished in a flash, leaving only deep scratches on the floor. I felt panic clutching at my throat. This dogman wasn't afraid of us, and in this labyrinth of abandoned rooms, it held all the advantages. We ran toward the exit, dragging the injured man behind us. Debris skidded underfoot, rotten boards creaked, and behind us came the sound of rapid, heavy steps, as if a beast was pursuing us side by side, only briefly hidden in the shadows. I caught a glimpse of a sharp silhouette flashing at the very edge of my vision. Bursting onto the porch, we nearly lost our footing on the rotted steps, but managed to keep our balance. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, its golden light painting the landscape in bloody hues. It seemed as though nature itself was warning us. Night was coming, and with it the dominion of this monster. The injured man was barely holding on, having lost too much blood, and the only thought pounding in my temples was to get off this cursed land at any cost. We scrambled to the truck, barely aware of our exhaustion and fear. Behind the house's door, the silhouette of the dogman appeared, not stepping into the open, but clearly asserting that the territory belonged to it. Its gaze, burning in the twilight, instilled a primal terror, and I knew that in these parts it had chased its victims to utter annihilation before. We hauled the injured man into the back seat of the pickup. Bart jumped behind the wheel without wasting a moment. I stared back at the house. The front door swayed in the wind, and inside, a dark shadow flitted by. The creature seemed to be mocking us, staying hidden in the light, yet asserting its control over the house. A chilling realization struck me. As night falls, the dogman emerges without hesitation, and then our chance for salvation becomes almost nil. Bart started the engine, and we sped away from Winterlow House. The pickup jolted over bumps. Its wheels skidded on the crumbling dirt road, but we drove as fast as we could. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a grim figure against the setting sun. For the first time in my life, I realized that the legends of the humanoid monster were not only true, but far more terrifying than any tale. After putting a safe distance between us and the estate, Bart stopped to catch his breath and check on the injured man. He was alive, but in desperate need of medical help. I noticed a strange mark on his arm, as if the beast hadn't just left wounds but had tagged its victim. A renewed sense of impending doom flared within me. Who knew what else such a bite might unleash? We reached the nearest telephone pole, where Bart contacted the local sheriff. In a grim tone, the sheriff said that someone needed to evacuate the truck from the estate. But I knew the authorities would hardly believe a story about a wolf-like creature. Most likely they'd chalk it up to a tragic accident or an attack by a wild animal. Yet one thing was clear to us. The dogman wasn't just a myth. This beast knew how to hunt and defend its territory, and Winterlow House would remain abandoned, continuing to lure in new thrill-seekers. We took the injured man to the abandoned Springs Clinic, where he was immediately admitted to intensive care. The doctor simply shook his head as he examined the torn wounds. I heard Bart quietly remark that now I, too, knew the truth about this place. His words rang out like a foreboding warning. I gazed at the sunset outside the hospital windows and realized that the world I once knew had been changed forever. Deep within Blue Hill lay a creature that would haunt this land for as long as it stood. Story 2. I never thought I'd start a new life in such an isolated place, but my divorce completely turned my plans upside down. When I first saw our new home on the outskirts of River Ridge, Oregon, I felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease. The ranch was a single-story structure built in 1959 with gray walls that had begun to crack with age and narrow windows along the front that let in a dim light. Adjacent to the house was a slanted gazebo with peeling paint on its railings, and surrounding the property was a damp, fog-filled forest. Neighbors said the forest stretched far into the distance, and that at night you could sometimes hear a howl. I was convinced it was just coyotes, but deep down, something stirred, as if warning me of impending trouble. My name is John. I'm 35, an electrician by trade, and a father of 2 girls. Kate, my 10-year-old daughter, is extremely sensitive to change. She often glances around nervously or freezes, listening to every sound. Bella, my 16-year-old stepdaughter, was her complete opposite. Quiet yet often lost in thought, she became fascinated with mysticism, reading esoteric books and seeming to perceive something in the house that I preferred not to notice. With me was Ashley, my new partner. We were trying to build a life together, but the events of the past few months made us constantly question our decision. My ex-wife, Mary, wasn't here. She only occasionally called or texted about Kate. The moment we crossed the threshold, a strange odor hit my nostrils, a scent reminiscent of wet earth mixed with old fur. I figured it was just dampness since the house had been empty for several months. Yet the smell lingered, as if it had seeped into the walls and saturated everything. In the corridor leading to the bedrooms, I noticed peeling paint and sloppily applied plaster. Likely the previous owners had started renovations, but never finished. In the kitchen, an old calendar still hung on the wall. Bella immediately pointed out the red marks on the dates of the full moon. I merely shrugged, deciding it was just a quirky habit of the former owner. Local rumors had it that the previous owner was a retired forester named Walter Savage. The locals said he suffered from a strange disease, almost like rabies, and after returning from his job at the forestry office, he barely showed his face in public. I dismissed it as just another local tale. What truly unnerved me, however, was the atmosphere of abandonment and the feeling that we weren't really expected here. The neighbors with whom I exchanged a few words all seemed rather withdrawn. Whenever I mentioned the house or the fact that it once belonged to Savage, their expressions would darken, and they would quickly change the subject. Within the first few hours after moving in, Kate complained that she felt uneasy. She claimed that someone flashed past at the far end of the hallway, but I told her it was just the play of shadows. We began unpacking, and I tried to distract the kids by setting up their rooms. Not far off, through the early morning fog, silhouettes of tall pines emerged. At dusk, their treetops would vanish into a milky haze, and I could catch a barely audible, drawn-out howl emanating from the woods. At that moment, I thought we were simply not used to the local nature. Yet Bella's gaze, filled with a grim sort of knowing, betrayed her anxiety. The calendar with its red marks loomed in my mind, and a premonition of something terrible had been with me from day one. The first few nights were restless. I often woke to inexplicable sounds. At first, it was just soft rustling, as if someone were sliding along the walls. Then creaks echoed, sounds resembling claws scratching against wood. I would get up, creep to the front door with my flashlight and inspect the yard, but I found nothing. I'd return and convince myself it was just fatigue or drafts. Yet one morning I discovered deep scratches on the door. They were oddly shaped, almost like a human handprint, but with long, jagged lines instead of fingers. I couldn't fathom what kind of animal or person could leave such marks. Kate began waking up in tears. She said she saw a tall shadow in the hallway that seemed to be watching her. I tried to stay calm and explained it was merely an interplay of light, but I couldn't shake the chill that crept up my spine. Bella remained silent, stealing glances at us as if she were expecting her hidden fears to be confirmed. Ashley, too, began mentioning that she felt uneasy, as if an unfamiliar presence roamed the rooms. One particularly odd spot was the half-basement under the kitchen. It was tiny and low, illuminated by a single light bulb on the ceiling. It was meant to serve as a storage room, yet it was always cold and damp, even when the weather outside was dry and clear. Every time I descended there, I had the unsettling feeling that something, a metal object like a shovel or a blade, was scraping the cement floor with a sharp sound. But when I switched on the light and looked around, there were no tools in sight, only empty boxes and old furniture left behind by the previous occupants. I decided to get a dog for protection and peace of mind. I chose a pit bull named Roxy, knowing how loyal and strong these dogs could be. But Roxy was immediately restless. She frequently whimpered at night while staring at the basement door. Sometimes she'd tuck her tail and growl, as if sensing something lurking in the corners. One night when I tried to take her out for a walk, the moment we opened the front door, she let out a low growl and darted back inside. I shined my flashlight on the porch. There was nothing there, yet the dog clearly saw or felt something I couldn't quite face. My unease grew when I detected a sharp, unfamiliar odor in one of the bedrooms, the one Kate occupied. It smelled like stale alcohol, mixed with an ammonia tang, reminiscent of wet hide. I aired the room out, keeping the window open nearly all day, yet the smell would vanish only to return suddenly, as if brought in by an invisible guest. Kate complained that it made her feel sick and said that sometimes she heard whispers or low grumbles, as if voices were emanating from deep within the walls. Every time I inspected the house, one thing became clear. We were dealing with something that defied ordinary explanation. On the 5th day after our move, Laura, a longtime friend of Ashley, came to visit. She planned to stay only a couple of nights, but her reaction to the house only deepened my apprehension. Barely stepping over the threshold, Laura seemed instantly on edge. She smiled politely, yet her eyes carried a heavy, almost oppressive look, as if she felt an unseen force. That night, I heard her toss and turn in a restless sleep through the thin walls of her room. In the morning, she appeared utterly exhausted, frequently glancing out the windows and looking over her shoulder as if someone were watching her. Later, she confided, without many details, that a loud knock had awoken her, and when she looked out the window, she saw a flash of red like a pair of burning eyes. I chose not to press her for more, trying not to aggravate the situation, though deep down I knew something otherworldly was unfolding in our home. That evening, my mobile rang. The caller ID was unknown. The voice on the other end introduced himself as a paranormal investigator and said he had received a call from my number. His voice was unfamiliar yet confident. I had never reached out to someone like that. Nor did I know that such enthusiasts existed in River Ridge. He mentioned old legends about a werewolf that supposedly had taken up residence in these woods many years ago and appeared every full moon. He added that some people with weak health might even transform under its influence. I wanted to ask him what he meant specifically, but only heard a few beeps before the call dropped. This unsettled me. I hadn't given anyone my number, and speaking with a mysterious investigator felt downright supernatural. By this point, Bella had become even more withdrawn. I noticed she spent hours in the half-basement with an old crate she'd found among the previous owner's belongings. One day, she brought up a yellowed newspaper clipping. Local forester Walter Savage bitten by unknown beast. The incident was dated on a full moon, though it had occurred many years ago. The article mentioned that Savage had been examined and diagnosed with a rare form of psychosis, possibly due to rabies. All of it sounded ominous, especially considering that our house had once belonged to him. Around the same time, I began hearing loud knocks on the walls at night, accompanied by sounds resembling the roar of a large animal. The entire family would wake in terror. The windows trembled, and Roxy whimpered and hid under the table. Several times I dashed outside, only to find nothing but cold wind and fog. Yet by morning I would discover large footprints in the yard, paw prints roughly the size of a human foot, complete with long claw marks. In one area, scraps of strange grayish fur lay in the grass, reminiscent of dog hair but stiff and emitting a repulsive odor. This confirmed my growing suspicion that some monstrous creature was roaming the woods. Even more chilling was the thought that this beast might not simply be an animal, but something linked to the ghost of the previous owner. Ashley and I decided to dig deeper into the history of the house. The local library kept archival records about River Ridge and its surroundings. According to them, Walter Savage had indeed worked as a forester until a mysterious attack in the woods changed everything. Allegedly, one late evening he returned home covered in bite marks and babbling incoherently, and from then on his life became a series of inexplicable episodes. Neighbors recalled seeing him roaming the yard at night, drinking homemade liquor, and sometimes eerie, beastly sounds emanated from his house. After Savage's death, the house changed hands several times, yet almost every owner left soon after. As the next full moon approached, the strange occurrences in our house grew more intense. I felt cornered. Doors would slam as if by themselves. Unseen footsteps echoed in the corridors, and the radio would turn on by itself, only to emit static interspersed with the coughing wheezes of an old man. One morning, as I headed into Kate's room, I noticed deep claw marks on the wall next to her bed, arranged like 5 distinct claws, as if someone had deliberately left a mark. Strangely, there were no signs of a break-in or attack. The window and door were locked, and Kate slept soundly. When she woke, pale and trembling, she said she had seen a black figure standing in the doorway in her dream. According to her, the stranger had red eyes and let out a beastly growl. Soon, I realized that it wasn't just a ghost haunting the place. 2 forces had merged here. A poltergeist-like presence connected to the soul of the old forester and something wild, something werewolf-like. At night, I heard howls that seemed to come from the far reaches of the forest, and sometimes even from the basement. The fur we found in the yard kept appearing in the most unexpected places. On the living room carpet, in the corner of a bedroom, even in my car under the seat. It was gray with streaks of white and smelled of something rotten and wet. Bella spent hours poring over the calendar with its marked full moon dates, making notes in her esoteric diary. I, on the other hand, didn't know what to hope for. A priest, a parapsychologist, or simply a swift escape from this cursed place? We had invested all our savings in this house, and I desperately hoped to find a rational explanation or a way to put an end to these disturbances. On the eve of the full moon, the silence became almost oppressive, as if the very air was thickening. Every evening my ears rang as if from drastic pressure changes, as though an unseen force were preparing for something dreadful. I dreamed of a moonlit path over the house. Bella wandered the basement with a dim lamp, searching for something, while Ashley struggled to get through to a few acquaintances who believed in the supernatural. I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The sense of imminent danger was nearly palpable, as if a beast lurked within the walls, waiting for the moment when the moon reached its full phase to reveal its true face. The day of the full moon turned out to be unusually overcast. By evening, the sky was shrouded in thick clouds, and it felt as though night had fallen prematurely. I bolted the front door, checked every window, and armed myself with flashlights. Ashley sat by the phone, trying in vain to reach that mysterious paranormal investigator as the connection kept dropping. Laura had already left, claiming that the atmosphere in the house was driving her insane. We were left alone with the girls and Roxy, who seemed more frightened than any of us. Her whimpers and sudden growls at dark corners were unmistakable. At midnight, I heard pounding against the walls and a piercing screech that was hard to distinguish from a human cry. The windows trembled and the lights flickered. I decided I had done enough waiting and bolted outside with my flashlight and a weapon. The forest behind the house looked like a vast, black abyss. The wet ground squelched underfoot, and I could hear something heavy leaping from place to place, breaking twigs and leaves. Suddenly, Roxy broke free from her leash and dashed into the trees. In the darkness, her loud bark was abruptly cut off by a terrifying, grinding noise. I ran after her, stumbling as my flashlight caught fleeting glimmers of eyes emerging from the darkness. Eyes that seemed to be at human height and disturbingly close. Then all at once an absolute silence fell, as if the entire forest had been muted. I can't recall how long it lasted, But when I came to, I found myself standing on the porch with scratches on my hands and blood I couldn't even identify as my own. My head buzzed and my heart pounded, as if I'd just awoken from a nightmare. I wasn't sure if I'd lost consciousness or if parts of the night had simply slipped away. On the steps, I noticed a clump of grayish fur that smelled of sweat and wet dog. The door to the house was slightly ajar, yet inside, everything felt suspended in a strange stupor. I was met by terrified looks from Ashley, Bella, and Kate. They insisted I'd been gone for no more than 15 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. The next morning, the house seemed to return to a semblance of normality, yet none of us could ignore what had happened. Roxy never returned. There was simply too much fear to remain. I knew in my heart that this house harbored something ancient and powerful, something that would never let its inhabitants go. Perhaps it was the lingering malice of Walter Savage, mixed with a genuine beastly curse that roamed the woods with every lunar phase. I watched as Bella silently packed up her things. Kate tried to hide her tears, and Ashley looked at me as if silently pleading forgiveness for our ill-fated adventure. We left that very day. I didn't bother seeking explanations from the neighbors or local authorities. I simply realized that the peace and safety of my family were more important than knowing the truth. As I slammed the car door and drove away from the property, I caught a glimpse out of the corner of my eye. A dark silhouette in the basement window. It seemed to have red eyes gleaming at me. Along the side of the house, something scraped and clawed, and then all fell silent. Later, I learned that the house was put up for sale again. They say several tenants have come and gone and no one stays for long. Neighbors claim that on moonlit nights a low howl still echoes from within, and in the windows, people see the shadow of a hunched figure with wolf-like eyes. I tried to erase it all from my memory, yet sometimes late at night I still dream of the sound of a shovel scraping on cement, and I catch that musty scent of fur. I wake up in a cold sweat, realizing that the past will not let go if it is steeped in beastly curses and the mournful presence of a ghost wandering the corridors of an abandoned house in River Ridge. Story 3. My name is Alan Sherman. I've always considered myself a level-headed, pragmatic person, someone who can logically explain any phenomenon. So when I was offered a new job in another state, I jumped at the chance to escape the noise and chaos of Denver, where my family and I had spent the last several years. The rising crime, constant worry about the kids, and never-ending traffic had robbed us of our peace. My wife Rebecca was equally fed up with the relentless stress of the big city. She dreamed of a safer environment for our 2 children, Ethan, who is 11, and Lily, who just turned 8. When we started looking for a home in a quiet neighborhood, an ad caught my eye. A spacious single-story house in the suburbs of the mountain town of Silver Pine. The house was built in the ranch style, surrounded by wooded land and set on a large lot with a creek running through it. The price surprised me. The property, which in the suburbs of a big city you'd hardly ever be able to afford, was selling for well below market value. The realtor explained that the previous owners had suddenly abandoned the house, and the bank had repossessed it. We didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to a mere coincidence. The house itself looked solid and cozy. A spacious living room with high ceilings, a couple of bedrooms, a study where I could work in peace, and a large kitchen that Rebecca had dreamed about for ages. There was also a 2-car garage, which turned out to be a major plus in the mountain climate. The crowning glory was an enormous porch that extended right to the edge of the woods. The kids immediately began to run around the yard, hugging our 2 dogs, Rex and Benny, and clinging to our cat Martin, who seemed less enthusiastic and instead cautiously sniffed around the new territory. As I pondered why the previous owners had left such a wonderful place, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. After all, deals involving bank-repossessed homes aren't uncommon. Perhaps their financial situation had suddenly changed, or they'd simply received another offer. We were excited about the prospect of living peacefully away from the city, growing our own vegetables on our plot, and enjoying the mountain scenery. The kids loved the idea of running free in the backyard, making new friends at their new school, and finally, as they put it, not hearing cars and sirens all day long. The first few days after moving in were a whirlwind of unpacking and settling in. We arranged the furniture, hung family photos on the walls, and made every room our own. I discovered a few curious details in the house. Strange marks on the doorframe, as if someone had left growth marks, and some old keys in a kitchen drawer for which I couldn't find any corresponding locks. Rebecca noted that in one of the bedrooms the wallpaper was only half removed, revealing children's drawings underneath. All of this lent the once lived-in space an air of mystery. Despite a slight uneasiness over these unfamiliar signs, we enjoyed the quiet. The mountain air was surprisingly fresh, and the night sky dazzled with bright stars. After dinner, I would step onto the porch and listen as the wind rustled through the tops of the pines in the distance. We felt a calm we hadn't known in the city. Whenever fear crept in about this new chapter, I just had to look at the kids' faces, lit with wonder. They were no longer afraid to go outside alone. There were no honking cars or crowded sidewalks here. Everything seemed to be going perfectly, and I truly believed that our decision to move to Silver Pine marked the start of a happy new chapter. None of us had any idea that this house held far more than it appeared on the surface, or that we'd soon encounter something that would upend everything we thought we knew about peaceful living. We moved into the new house at the beginning of September, when the weather in Silver Pine was still mild. Over the first few months, we managed to settle in, and our family gradually adjusted to the slower pace of small-town life. I began working remotely, enjoying the fact that the internet here was quite reliable. Rebecca took charge of sprucing up the property. She ordered outdoor furniture, set up a small garden bed, and raved about the unusually clean air. The kids enrolled in the local school, where they were shy at first but soon made new friends. The house continued to pleasantly surprise us. It turned out to be even more spacious than the photos had suggested. In the living room stood a large fireplace, which we fired up on the first chilly evenings. The old wooden floors creaked invitingly underfoot, and the wide windows let in plenty of light. Rebecca loved spending her mornings on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun's rays filter through the pines. I, too, enjoyed such a start to the day, a quiet, serene beginning, as if we lived in a completely different world. The yard in front of the house was a well-kept lawn that gave way to a small grove, and at the back it sloped down to a creek crossed by a weathered wooden bridge. Sometimes the kids and I would walk along the bank, listening to the gentle murmur of the water and watching the little fish dart among the stones. Beyond the creek, a dense thicket began, seemingly untouched by man. We tried not to let the dogs roam there, fearing wild animals. Yet Rex and Benny clearly thrived on the proximity of the forest. They raced about the yard, barking at unseen critters in the underbrush, and persistently tried to cross the property line. Martin, the cat, preferred to stay closer to the house, often perched on the windowsill, staring at the woods as if expecting something mysterious. As autumn set in, the landscape transformed with hues of gold and red. The trees slowly shed their leaves, and long shadows stretched across the yard as the sun retreated. I loved watching how nature here moved to its own rhythm, undisturbed by the clamor of city streets. In early October, when the air noticeably turned colder, we turned on the house's heating system. The fireplace became our evening ritual. Rebecca and I would sit by the fire, sipping tea while the kids watched TV. Once darkness fell outside, an almost impenetrable silence reigned. I even began to wonder if we had grown too accustomed to the constant noise of the city, since now we were surprised by complete quiet. But it wasn't long before that silence started to take on a menacing tone. Late at night, I would sometimes hear the snap of branches somewhere outside. I dismissed it as deer or raccoons rummaging around the yard in search of food. One evening, as I stepped onto the porch to check the outdoor lights before an impending rain, I noticed that the motion sensor lamps had suddenly turned on, even though no one was around. Perhaps a sudden gust of wind had triggered them. I tried not to dwell on it. After all, forests are full of animals that might wander near a house. Soon, the oddities began to repeat. Near the bridge, I once found scattered twigs arranged neatly in a shape resembling a triangle. I thought the kids might have done it, but Ethan insisted he hadn't gone near the creek for days, having been sidelined by a sudden cold. Lily looked at me with such earnest eyes that any doubts vanished. They weren't making it up. Rebecca mentioned that someone had shifted her potted plants on the porch. Perhaps a small animal had dashed by, curious about the scent of fresh earth. Still, we felt safe. The security system was in perfect working order, and the local police assured us that crime here was nearly non-existent. I had no inkling that these minor warnings were only the precursors to something far more sinister. I like to believe that everything happening was just natural, trivial things not worth worrying about. But soon I realized that behind the serene beauty of these mountain landscapes lurked something utterly alien to our familiar world. I began paying closer attention to the little details outside. Every evening before bed, I would inspect the yard. Sometimes, when the weather was clear, I'd shine a powerful flashlight over the back area, hoping to spot a raccoon or rabbit in the bushes. But all I ever caught was the faint movement of a shadow or the rustle of leaves as if someone had hurriedly retreated behind the trees. Then came a series of odd incidents with the motion sensors. The outdoor lamps would flash on without any apparent cause, one after the other, as if something unseen was moving around the house. One early morning, I decided to walk around the perimeter, hoping to find traces like paw prints or displaced branches. I found nothing. Despite the moist ground from last night's rain, there were no prints or flattened grass. I hesitated to involve the dogs in these searches, fearing they might chase after something and get lost in the woods. Rebecca admitted that for several nights in a row she had been hearing strange creaks coming from deep within the forest. These sounds were unlike the typical nighttime noises we were used to hearing outside our windows. I tried to reassure her that it was probably just the wind snapping branches or coyotes howling, but even I couldn't shake a growing sense of uncertainty. The tone of that creak sent shivers down my spine. A pitiful moan that somehow escalated into a hoarse shout, leaving me with a deep, unsettling dread. Then one evening something else happened. Our dog's food bowl, which we always left by the back door, disappeared. Initially, I thought raccoons had gotten to it, but the idea wasn't comforting, especially since the bowl had vanished without a trace. The next day, an even stranger occurrence was noted. Several garden tools from the porch were neatly arranged in a different spot, even though none of us had moved them. The kids were busy with schoolwork and wouldn't have tampered with the rakes if I hadn't asked for help. Rebecca merely shrugged, convinced that such a thing was simply out of character. By this point, I was feeling an increasing sense of tension. Inside the house, nothing seemed to jeopardize our safety. But stepping outside, I could feel a presence. It felt as though someone was silently watching us from the forest. Ethan mentioned one night that he'd dreamed of tall shadows roaming the yard, reaching out toward the windows. I tried not to react too emotionally to the boy's story, but deep down I knew his imagination might be picking up on something that the adults were trying to dismiss as coincidence. The growing unease prompted me to beef up our security system. I installed additional motion sensor floodlights and even considered setting up outdoor cameras. I hadn't reported anything to the police yet. What could I say? The dog's bowl disappeared and I hear rustling in the woods at night. They'd probably just dismiss it. But that nagging sense of foreboding tightened in my throat. I imagined an unseen guest moving around our house at night, watching us through the windows and studying every one of our habits. We lived on an isolated lot with neighbors miles away, a fact that had initially seemed like a blessing, privacy and tranquility. Now I found myself wondering if we'd become too isolated. Who would we call for help if something happened? In those moments, I felt angry with myself for beginning to fear old superstitions. But the strange noises and inexplicable movements of objects spoke for themselves. I didn't know how serious it was, and I tried to suppress the panic while keeping up a facade of calm in front of Rebecca and the kids. A bitter suspicion nagged at me. Perhaps the previous owners hadn't left on a whim. Our peaceful existence was beginning to crumble like a forest losing its last dry leaves. Then came the night I will never forget. Around 3 a.m, Benny, our more nervous dog, suddenly woke up near the back door and started whimpering. I sensed that he had picked up on something, as he'd never shown such anxiety before. I got out of bed and tried to soothe him with gentle pats, but the dog continued to scratch at the door as if demanding to be let out. Unease crept over me, but I decided to investigate so that I might finally get some answers. Grabbing my flashlight and throwing on my jacket, I carefully opened the door. No sooner had we stepped into the yard than Benny bolted toward the creek. I called after him, trying not to shout and wake the others. Clutching my flashlight, I hurried after the dog, slipping on the slightly frozen grass. The night air was cold and stung the skin, and the moon cast a feeble glow over the deserted backyard. I crossed the bridge and found myself plunged into utter darkness, with my flashlight illuminating only a narrow corridor between tree trunks. Benny stopped, his ears pricked up, and he let out a low growl as he stared deep into the woods. At that very moment, I heard something that froze me in place, a chilling, inhuman scream. The sound was like a mix of howling wind and scraping metal, piercing to the bone. My heart pounded so hard I could almost hear it in my ears. The silence around made that scream all the more sinister, as if it had come from another world. Benny took a step back, tail tucked between his legs. I was about to turn back when I suddenly heard someone call my name. The voice sounded exactly like Rebecca's, soft and drawn out like an echo in an empty hall. For a moment, I was paralyzed. I knew Rebecca was asleep in the house and couldn't possibly be out here. I aimed my flashlight toward the direction of the voice and caught a glimpse, just a fraction of a second, of a tall, thin figure that immediately darted behind a thick pine trunk. I couldn't make out its face, but I did notice its eyes briefly flashing in the beam, like those of an animal. Fear robbed me of my breath. The only thought in my mind was, "That's not a human." Benny whimpered and pressed close to me as that same voice, mimicking my wife's tone, echoed again from deep in the woods. Without another second's hesitation, I grabbed the dog's collar and bolted back toward the creek. In my haste, I tripped and fell to my knees in the cold water, but I wouldn't let go of Benny. My legs froze almost immediately, yet panic spurred me on. I scrambled back to my feet and, panting heavily, crossed the bridge. Looking back, I saw movement flickering in the forest, but I couldn't make out anything except vague outlines of branches. Finally, when I reached the yard, I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against the wall, trying to still my trembling. All that greeted me was the oppressive silence of our dark house. Inside, Rebecca stood in the hallway, lit by the weak glow of a nightlight, staring at me with frightened eyes. I couldn't say a word, afraid my voice might betray me. We exchanged tense looks. I was too shocked to pretend that everything was normal. Benny had curled up under the kitchen table, his fur wet and his eyes full of fear. My mind raced with questions. What had I seen? What kind of creature could mimic my wife's voice? I couldn't come up with a logical explanation. Adrenaline still surged through my veins. And I couldn't shake the memory of that bone-chilling scream and the mocking echo of my name. For the first time in a long while, I felt genuine terror. The warm light of our home did little to dispel the sensation that a dark figure still lurked nearby. I spent the rest of the night sleepless, straining to catch every little sound, desperately hoping that morning would bring clarity. Deep down, though, I knew clarity wasn't coming. The next morning, I washed my face with cold water, trying to wash away the memories of that night. But the animals were still on edge. Rex growled at the front door whenever I approached it, and Martin meowed incessantly, as if sensing danger. Benny rarely left his corner under the table, clearly traumatized. Rebecca, too, was noticeably nervous, though she tried to hold herself together. When the kids woke up, they sensed the tension and wandered through the house, frightened by the eerie silence we'd created in an effort to avoid raising further questions. I knew that trusting instinct alone wasn't enough. Determined to act, I inspected the backyard in the daylight. Near the creek, there were no signs of intrusion, only small twigs and fallen leaves. The bridge looked as if it hadn't been used in ages except for the tracks I'd left the previous night. There was no evidence of any outsider. I considered calling the police or the rangers, but what would I tell them? I heard a terrifying scream and saw a figure acting inhumanly. They'd probably think I was crazy or suspect me of abusing alcohol. Yet the feeling of threat didn't dissipate. I could no longer view our lot, the woods, or even the nighttime silence with the same serene detachment as before. The memory of that voice, imitating Rebecca, haunted me. Knowing I had a family to protect, I decided to take action. I bought several extra floodlights, reinforced the door locks, and considered installing security cameras. Rebecca agreed. She wanted to be sure we did everything possible to stay safe. We tried not to discuss it in front of the kids, not wanting to heighten their fears, but Ethan and Lily had already sensed that something was terribly wrong. With each passing night, our fears grew. The motion sensor lamps continued to flicker on randomly, as if something was circling the house, always avoiding direct confrontation. I couldn't shake the thought that the creature I'd seen was capable of mimicking voices and might be far smarter than we were willing to believe. What terrified me most was the feeling that we had no control over its appearance. A few more times we heard that piercing scream, once near midnight and another time before dawn. The sound made the windows tremble, and our dogs went into a full-blown panic. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, grab my flashlight, and dash through the house, peeking out the windows only to see nothing but darkness, in which some unknown nightmare seemed to hide. By day, everything appeared to be an ordinary country home. yet our nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Rebecca and I began to wonder whether we should pack up and leave. But it wasn't that simple. The house was mortgaged, my job was remote, and the kids attended school there. And where would we go? We hated the big city, yet moving again would mean enormous expenses and a return to old problems. And the nightly terror offered no guarantee that somewhere else would be better. It was unbearable to watch fear erode the joy in our family life. The final straw came one night when the motion sensor lamps began to turn on sequentially, as if an unseen visitor were systematically checking every corner of the yard. I listened intently into the silence and could hear the faint crunch of snow underfoot. Then everything fell silent. No one banged on doors, no windows were shattered, no one broke into the house. But the next morning I noticed a wet handprint on the back door's glass, a long, elongated imprint with fingers that looked almost like claws. At that moment I realized, whatever is out in the woods is watching and studying us, and it hasn't yet decided to launch a full-on attack. Perhaps we were only at the beginning of a story that might end far more gruesomely. I couldn't shake the thought that the previous owners had experienced something similar and fled without a trace. And now, as the sun rose once more over the still land of silver pine, I sat on the porch staring toward the trees, waiting for some sign or further development. It felt as if the silence was the calm before a storm that was only a matter of time, and no security system, it seemed, could protect us from something that mimics voices and inspires a bone-deep terror simply by its presence.